Coming up.
There are many very serious allegations about the UAE that they are actively supporting the RSF, which is committing genocide. And also there's some detailed analysis in the New York Times suggesting that the UAE is misusing the Red Crescent as a way of trying to cover for their efforts to smuggle arms into Sudan. My understanding of international law is that if this is true, this would make the UAE not only guilty of supporting perpetrators of war crimes, but guilty of war crimes themselves by misusing the Red Crescent.
Despite their advocacy, their research, their work, their policy recommendations, their appeals to governments around the world, why is it that this is a crisis that is not getting the attention it deserves?
You know, that's how it's this new form of the way that they're exploiting Africa for its resources.
You started to say the word colonization, so a kind of colonization. Do you think Iran is similarly motivated by resources control, kind of new colonial strategy?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
For committee.
Briefings that I've received on the crisis in Sudan suggest that the ongoing violence combined with the humanitarian consequences make this likely to be the worst humanitarian crisis since the so-called Great Leap Forward in China in the 1950s. You talked about a scenario of mass starvation, potentially up to 12 to 13 million people next year. To put that in context, that is well over 5 times the total population of the Gaza Strip. And I don't think very many Canadians are aware of the particulars of this crisis. I think it would be deeply troubling to many Canadians to find out some of the facts you shared. Tens of millions of people affected by acute hunger already. And at a minimum, this is a situation that requires our serious attention and intense resolve and response. It seems to me, based on what I've read in your testimony today, that a critical step forward would be to do more to block the flow of arms into Sudan by shaming and penalizing any country or non-state actor sending weapons to either side. Just briefly, would both witnesses agree with that in principle?
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate on that.
Okay, and from Amnesty, would you agree with that?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat your questions? I just I've just been informed that my micro is not working well. I hope it is working now.
It's on time, but the question was, would you agree that a critical step forward would be for us to take action to block the flow of arms into Sudan, shaming and penalizing any country sending weapons to either side?
Yes, I will agree. I'm sorry, I think that there's a problem with my micro. I hope you can hear me.
Thank you. I'll proceed and we'll dig into this a bit further. This is a proxy war, different actors sending weapons in and waging a conflict at the expense of the Sudanese people. Many of the players are unsurprising, are involved in fomenting conflict and violence in other parts of the world. Unsurprisingly, the governments of Iran and Russia are involved. But the UAE is a player that we have more of a relationship with, let's say, than some of the others. There are many very serious allegations about the UAE that they are actively supporting the RSF, which is committing genocide. And also there's some detailed analysis in the New York Times suggesting that the UAE is misusing the Red Crescent as a way of trying to cover for their efforts to smuggle arms into Sudan. My understanding of international law is that if this is true, this would make the UAE not only guilty of supporting perpetrators of war crimes, but guilty of war crimes themselves by misusing the Red Crescent. So maybe Mr. Diamond, if you can comment on the UAE's actions here and what we can do to put maximal pressure on the UAE as part of a campaign to keep arms from flowing into Sudan.
Yeah, thank you, MP Genius. The UAE, as you note, yes, I mean, Canada, it still remains Canada within the top 20 importers of Canadian military exports. And so, yes, there's a lot that Canada can do to end this, at least put pressure on the UAE so that our weapons don't become complicit that Canada's weapons don't become complicit in their crimes in Sudan. So under the arms trade treaty obligations, the purpose is to prevent and eradicate the illicit trade of arms. Canada is a state party, right? Ratified the convention and has enshrined it in domestic law. But, this requires oversight also by Parliament. You can't just rely on the minister to, end all permits until the UAE proves that it is not funding genocide. Sending these weapons to genocidaires. Unlike other situations, these transfers may further breach, as we talked about, the UN arms embargo. There's already a UN arms embargo. So there's plenty of legal grounds to bar the flow of arms to the UAE.
Can I just jump in because of limited time? So, not exporting Canadian arms to the UAE is one recommendation. What other steps would you suggest to apply pressure to the UAE? And I should mention Egypt as well is believed to be supporting the other side of the conflict. And Egypt is a country that we have a relationship with much warmer in general than with some of the other belligerent supporters.
Yeah, but I mean, for in terms of the UAE, we know that the evidence is a lot more solid, and it's supporting a side that is, committing mass killing against massacring non-Arab groups and committing mass rape and sexual and gender-based violence against individual members of these communities based on their identity. So the House can also pass a motion, outlining and calling for ceasing the transfer of arms per this legislation, right? In the same way that the House passed Motion 658, right, ending the arms exports to Israel and Hamas. I understand that's not binding, but at least that is something that might get the ball rolling on this initiative to end arms transfer to the UAE until they end their support for the RSF. So it's one thing for the government to claim, if there aren't being arms, but we need more parliamentary oversight if the UAE continues to be our top 20 importer of exports for military goods.
Which other players should we be paying attention to in terms of that are contributing to the conflict?
Excuse me, Mr. Guinness' time is out, and probably in the next round.
So, I mean, we mentioned some of the other actors. Amnesty put out a report. Others have put out reports. The panel of experts, the UN panel of experts, is continuing to monitor this. Russia, the Wagner Group, and China, Turkey, Iran, Serbia. But the state that we have been following most closely, and the one where most of the entities that have been sanctioned already are based in the UAE and are supporting the RSF. And we've heard in our own diplomatic discussions, right, that without the UAE support, the RSF would collapse. And so this is, probably the biggest exporter of conflict on the continent, the UAE. And so we need to increase the pressure and actually focus on imposing costs on the UAE, not allowing it to get away with this.
We talked a lot about the UAE. I want to talk a little bit right now about Russia. There was a report I read called Blood Gold, and it was about how Russia, through the Wagner Group, has raised $2.5 billion US from trade in African gold since it invaded the Ukraine in February of 2022. In Sudan, a Russian company controls a major refinery that has allowed Wagner to become the dominant buyer of unprocessed Sudanese gold. with multiple accounts of Russian military transport planes shipping processed gold out of the country. I'm just wondering if either of you have want to speak to that and the influence that the Wagner Group is having in Sudan. Mr. Diamond, I see you're shaking your head. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I was waiting because I mean I believe Amnesty also identified Russia, but yeah, I mean this is not something that I've personally been involved in investigating, but you know we have heard in our discussions that, of course, the same way Russia has continued to sort of wade through the sanctions by the international community. Part of that is the gold trade. And so, countries like Russia and UAE are aligning themselves in a way that they can weather these kind of storms. And, that's really important to track and to try and target those networks that are operating in the shadows, smuggling underneath the scrutiny of international mechanisms.
Did Amnesty want to comment as well?
I don't have much to add. We know that Russia contributes to the arming of the belligerent forces, the warring factions in Sudan. And what you put forward is very plausible and very possible, but that very much goes beyond my expertise. I don't have any specific information vis-a-vis Amnesty reports on this subject.
Okay, thank you. Human Rights Watch indicated that the signing of the Juba Peace Agreement in October 2020 between Sudan's transitional government and the country's rebel groups paradoxically gave rise to new group recruitment in Darfur. How can the international community support and foster the conditions for peace that do not unintentionally result in the entrenchment of violence? Maybe I'll turn to Amnesty if that's okay. If you want it.
Well, once again, that's a big question. Il n'y a pas de recette miracle.
There's no miracle solution to implement everything to ensure that there's respect of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, diplomacy and negotiations. We have to use the international system as best we can, which already exists and which is really ailing at the moment, unfortunately.
Mr. Diamond, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean that's a really excellent question and very difficult. I think more important focus, while these are, there's an interplay, but the need to protect civilians needs to be at top of mind and guiding the discussions, because there's no end in sight to the war, and so we can't really discuss what the future of Sudan will look like right now until the warring parties can no longer receive the supplies they need, and until that they cease fighting, and that the civilians receive the protection that they need, from an international monitoring force or mechanism. So I would say that the focus really can't be yet on that, but it has to be on how the international community can intervene to stop the violence.
Commentary opened up this discussion by describing 12 million people potentially dying from starvation, making this the biggest refugee crisis, the biggest starvation crisis of this century, and perhaps even in history. Can I ask, it does deserve deep attention. Should the international conversation not be more affected by what we are seeing happen in this crisis in Sudan? If I could turn to both our colleagues from Amnesty International and Raoul Wallenberg to try from their perspective explain, despite their advocacy, their research, their work, their policy recommendations, their appeals to governments around the world, why is it that this is a crisis that is not getting the attention it deserves? Perhaps Amnesty could start.
Merci, c'est une très bonne.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Once again, it's a very broad-based one. Unfortunately, Sudan is not the sole conflict. It's not the sole humanitarian crisis that's not being given sufficient attention currently. The reason for this is that the international system is no longer working. The United Nations is no longer working. The UN Security Council is no longer working either because it's become too politicized. It's always been politicized, but before there was more of a balance. And now the parties that are actually taking decisions at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly no longer care about the humanitarian law balance because it no longer works for them. So each state, for example, China, Russia, also the US, they use their veto as soon as something doesn't suit them. The system really is broken, and that is why everything becomes highly politicized, and our attention is diverted elsewhere. And in the meantime, the states within the UN Security Council are actually stoking these conflicts throughout the world, while our backs are turned and the cameras, the media, and the lights are not at all trained on these crises. So we have to work on repairing the UN system.
Appreciate that perspective on how the UN system is broken and is failing the people of Sudan. Perhaps then our colleague at the Raoul Wallenberg Center could spend some time describing why is it that the major media have not been appropriately shedding the kind of attention that this crisis warrants?
Yeah, no, I think that's the ultimate question and a very painful one to think about. I also just want to add regarding the Wagner Group that the Raoul Wallenberg Center did submit a comprehensive sanctions filing with the government, including Wagner Group. And, unfortunately, the government didn't respond in a timely enough fashion. I also want to sort of put it in there a recommendation to, take these recommendations and to have quicker processing times for our, sanctions recommendations, because often the companies that are then suggested to be sanctioned can switch hands and, liquidate and evade accountability. I also want to say that regarding the peace agreement question, in the past, the peace agreement has been bilateral, and so any future agreement really needs to be comprehensive and all-inclusive with all parties, including those who have been, historically marginalized and oppressed in Darfur. Otherwise, it will continue to breed resentment and a kind of neglect. And in terms of the lack of attention, there's really there's no explanation for it. I mean, other than a derelict of duty by everyone in any form of power or anyone who has a platform. Because there's also a lot of inaccurate information, even a failure to even document basic information about Sudan. There's no way to explain it other than a failure.
Ms. Langlois, that you talked about the violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law, but because it's an internal conflict, you made the distinction in terms of the Geneva Convention and other kinds of international law. I wonder if you could specify and then leave a little bit of time, I think, for Mr. Diamond to also respond about specifically the violations that are happening right now of international human rights law and what Canada can do to ensure that those violations stop.
Merci pour la question. Alors,
thank you for that question. Civilians are being targeted blindly, and the two warring parties position themselves in civilian zones to launch their attacks, and so they're endangering civilians, and there's tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed and injured. We refer to sexual violence against women and children. And there's also the question of humanitarian aid that's not able to get through because access to humanitarian aid is being blocked. And they also target civilian facilities providing water or electricity, and that also has an impact, of course, on the civilian population. So it's all of these measures that are condemned under international human rights law. It also applies in a conflict such as the Sudanese conflict, which is not between two states, not an international conflict, therefore, but under the Geneva Convention or under international law, this still can apply between the two warring factions within the same country.
Oh, if I may add, I just want to say, in terms of what the international community has been able to do, though, to stop those kind of violations, historically, the International Criminal Court tried to issue an arrest warrant, let's say, against al-Bashir. And I just want to note that the traditional ways of doing things might have brought us to this point and are not necessarily the best forms of deterrent. Concrete ways of maybe stopping the violence is to block the flow of what's the sources of their funding? Where are they getting their military supplies? How are they able to continue these atrocities? That obviously will penalize them more than the threat of, future sort of prosecutions for violations or like threatening Sudan or RSF with, that they're violating human rights, because we know that really, that's not, when we're speaking of genocide and mass atrocity crimes, I think that we share the same goal, but I'm not quite sure if traditional ways of looking at it are the best way to go about it.
I guess one of the other questions I have for you, Mr. Diamond, regarding the Arms Trade Treaty, in the enabling legislation in Canada, it does actually specify that the minister must not allow an export permit if there's a substantial risk that one of the listed areas, and I believe that was actually an amendment in the Foreign Affairs Committee to say must instead of may. So if you could clarify what might be done differently, given that right now under law, it would actually be illegal to allow that kind of export permit.
This it seems like a little bit of an opaque way of enforcing this sort of law. I'm not exactly sure how the assessment or evaluation works, if it's transparent or not. But certainly, this is something that I believe Parliament can ask and request and demand that all these exports are being reviewed in a way that against the risks that are now known of where these weapons can end up.
Mr. Diamond, you also mentioned that you have, I think there were 10 other entities or individuals that have been sanctioned by other countries like the U.S. that you were going to submit to this committee. I would ask if you could submit those names and if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, some of these companies are controlling, business interests of the RSF from the UAE or have sent vehicles armed with machine guns. So these are key entities that Canada has yet to sanction, and I look forward to submitting those names.
And I noticed you mentioned countries like Russia and China, but you also mentioned Serbia. What is the nature of what Serbia is doing in this regard? I can't remember if it was you or if it was Ms. Langlois that mentioned that. Ms. Langlois?
C'est moi qui ai mentionné ça. Donc,
I mentioned this. Serbia and China, please quickly. So Serbia and China are two of the countries that are shipping arms to Sudan, and yet they have indeed signed the arms trade treaty, so they're in contradiction with their own obligations. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Guinness, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Today, about tens of millions of people in Sudan displaced, starving, or already killed. We must do more here in Canada. We need to hold all violators of human rights accountable, whether they're on the ground in Sudan itself or whether they are foreign enablers. And we've heard that the Government of Canada has been behind on imposing sanctions, so it's critically important that we tighten those up and, in the process, hold foreign enablers accountable as well. I want to draw your attention to one aspect of recent New York Times reporting. I'm quoting here, while not admitting direct support to the RSF, Sheikh Mohammed, that's from the UAE, said he owed the paramilitary group's leader, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, for sending troops to fight alongside the Emiratis in the war in Yemen. Okay, so one way to think of the war in Sudan is that it's an extension of the war in Yemen, with Iran and the UAE fighting for power and control. It seems, based on what I've read, that Iran would like resources in Sudan, but also a strategic foothold, and that UAE doesn't want Iran to have that strategic foothold. And there are other relationships established in the context of the Yemeni conflict that are spilling over. Mr. Diamond, just very quickly, because I've got limited time, but what are your thoughts on that kind of frame, and what does Iran want in Sudan specifically?
Yeah, I'll say I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I won't try and address that. But I wouldn't say it's only in terms of sort of like fighting over regional control. I think the UAE is also just exploiting this war for control of resources, including the very powerful gold trade. It's just and it's been involved militarily in Ethiopia, in Tigray, and also in Libya, where it backs the warlord Khalifa Haftar. So, that's how it's this new form of the way that they're exploiting Africa for its resources.
You started to say the word colonization, so a kind of colonization. Do you think Iran is similarly motivated by resources control, kind of new colonial strategy?
I won't say I know as much about that side.
I want to ask about the Sudanese democracy movement. There was a lot of hope, including in the Sudanese diaspora here in Canada, about what could come about following the initial democratic revolution. What are the prospects for the democracy movement to be able to become a player in the country's politics again, and how can we specifically support the pursuit of the Sudanese people for a free and democratic future?
Je ne sais pas à qui s'adressait la question.
I don't know to whom the question was addressed, but I can try to answer on that. This movement has been completely suppressed. And the current conflict, amongst other things, has arisen as a result of the negotiations for a democratic transition. So that would seem to indicate that hope for the moment for a democratic transition has basically been wiped out. Now, of course, the democratic movement may still exist, but it doesn't have the necessary space anymore in order to be heard. That is why it's important to quickly arrive at a diplomatic solution to resolve this conflict in a negotiated way, so that once again we can go back to this question of democratic transition and put forward the Sudanese democratic movement in its rightful place.
Rather than your recommendation would be that the order of operations is denial of arms, political solution, and then the revivification of the democracy movement. Are there things that we can do in the meantime, though, to support kind of a laying of groundwork by the democracy movement so that they're in a stronger position when hopefully the conflict is brought to an end?
In a 20 seconds, please.
Ms. Lang.
Oui, bien sûr, il faut continuer.
Of course, we have to continue to support the democratic movement in Sudan and civic society as much as we can. But first of all, there needs to be resolution of the conflict, and we need to stop providing arms to Sudan, and we need to negotiate a transition.
Thank you, Mr. Guinness. I would like to thank our witnesses for your time, for your good answer. The illustration you gave to this committee, to all members, is highly appreciated. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.